All right, this is a very serious, very disturbing story, but we got to talk about it because it got a lot of. It needs to be spread wider because people need to read what is going on here. Here's the question that kind of opens up this story. What is the right way to reconcile with someone who caused you harm when you were a child? Specifically, what if someone abused you as a child? Should you reconcile with them? And if so, how do you do it? Obviously, there's no right answer to how you do that, but there sure as hell is a wrong way. For example, what if your father drives you to a parking lot to meet your pastor and the guy who abused you so that everyone can just hug it out and then never speak of it again? That is a real thing that just happened, and it involves this church right here, the Old Apostolic Lutheran Church of Duluth, Minnesota. And that is the subject of a stunning article published by ProPublica and the Minnesota Star Tribune. The headline here: young girls were sexually abused by a church member. They were told to forgive and forget. This is Jessica Lussenhop and Andy Mannix writing this piece. But I want to share with you about that parking lot incident. Look at what they said to this girl after her father drove her to that parking lot. In front of the girl, her father, and Daryl Bruckelmyer, who was the pastor of that church, Clint Massie, who was the alleged abuser, asked her for her forgiveness. Looming over her, the three men wept. Then the girl's dad and preacher allowed the man who had been sexually abusing her since kindergarten to hug her. It was one of the worst things ever, she told police some 15 years later. In accordance with one of the core tenets of their church, the matter was resolved. It was forgiven. It should now be forgotten. If she spoke of it again, she would be guilty of having an unforgiving heart, and the sins would become hers. But she could never forget, and neither could the other children. Oh my God, there are other children. So that's disturbing. Lots of other children. Wait for it. So that's the opening of this article in the by ProPublica and the Minnesota Star Tribune. They basically say Bruckelmyer, the pastor running this church, he knew what Clint Massie had done to that girl and to other kids in that church, but his solution always involved forgiveness sessions and never reporting Massie to local law enforcement. Now, you need to know this because we've talked about this in the past. Are clergy members mandated reporters? You know this if you're a social worker at a public school, for example, and you find out that there is abuse going on. A kid tells you that. You see bruises, something like that. You have a legal obligation to report that to your superiors and tell law enforcement. If, and by the way, pastors in Minnesota, they are mandated reporters. So if they find out about abuse, they have to let law enforcement know too. Now, the times we've talked about that in the past, the question's always what happens if they learn about abuse through the act of confession? Someone mentioned they were abused or they are an abuser in a confession booth. Then do the pastors have to report it? And all the lawmakers are like, yes. And the clergy members are like, no, we want to keep that a secret. And that's messed up in a lot of ways. But the bottom line is everything I'm just talking about right here, none of this involves the confession booth. All of this is just the pastor very clearly knowing there is abuse going on and still not reporting it to law enforcement. Okay, so Bruckelmyer, he knew about this guy's actions. He should have reported it. He was legally obligated to report it. He did not report it. And then, because there were no consequences, no real consequences for anything Clint Massie did, guess what happened? Exactly what you would think. The abuse continued, victim after victim. It was only this year that this guy, here's Clint Massie for you right here. It's only this year that he was finally sentenced to any sort of prison time for what he did. And check this out. This is a headline that was in the Duluth News Tribune. Duluth area man sent to prison for sexual abuse of 2 girls. This is dated March of 2025. But as I told you, that girl who went to the parking lot in that opening story, she only told police that, yeah, that happened to me 15 years ago. So this guy only now has been put in jail for a short time for what he did. By the way, he was sentenced to over 7 years in prison for multiple counts of felony criminal sexual conduct with victims under the age of 13. But the fact that he got sentenced, it's not because of the church cooperation. It's because people finally went around the church for this to happen. Okay? And let me share with you some other things that were in that piece that were disturbing in the ProPublica piece. Look at this. Law enforcement first became aware of the allegations against Massie in 2017. They said that the church's lack of cooperation, including pressuring potential witnesses and victims to stay quiet about the abuse and preachers failing to report it to authorities, was a major factor in the delay in bringing charges. The church was actively impeding this investigation because they did not want people to talk about it. And basically, the reason the church never ratted out this guy is because they already had internal policies on how to handle allegations of wrongdoing. What is their solution? Their solution involves things like taking care of the soul, but never telling the cops what's happening. And that meant Bruckelmyer, the pastor, never faced any punishment for standing in the way of justice, no matter how long the list of victims kept getting. So how did law enforcement find out what this guy was up to, if not from the pastor? Well, let's start with the girl who was told to hug her abuser. She's anonymous in the piece, by the way, but it started when she was 16. She started meeting with a secular counselor, and she started talking about her childhood and what Clint Massie did to her. Well, guess what? A counselor is also a mandated reporter, and she took her job seriously. So she did tell law enforcement what this girl had told her. And then that led to more details from the girl. Look at this part of the article. Sergeant Jessica Labor was the investigator assigned to the case. In a recorded interview, the girl reluctantly told Labor how she used to sit with Massie and his wife Sarah at church just a few rows from the front. Massie would snake his hands up her skirt and touch her thighs and genitals. Another time at a gathering at the home of her parents' friends, she said, Massie told her to get a blanket and began touching her underneath it with her mom and dad nearby. What the hell? You know what's also disturbing in that piece? The girl says she's still a member of that church today because she just believes she's in the right place. Her parents also stopped cooperating with the investigation because they believed that the church's forgive and forget policy is the right one. In fact, the girl's mother later said she believed Massie learned his lesson, even though he was still targeting other children. Like, there's a lot of Stockholm syndrome floating around in this church. But because the family did not want to cooperate with the cops, that meant the cops could not reasonably press charges against that guy. But as of 2017, he was finally on their radar. So over the next few years, the police started getting some anonymous tips about what this guy was up to. They knew he was still abusing children. They knew Bruckelmyer, the pastor, knew about it, but the victims were still not speaking up. So they tried a different approach. They went to the pastor and said, hey, pastor, do you know what the law says about mandated reporters? Check this out. Like, the sergeant went to meet with the pastor. Labor explained the state's mandatory reporting law to Bruckelmyer and told him that he and others at the church could be charged criminally if someone that they already know about were to keep abusing children and they failed to report it. I feel like when she says this to them, she's like, wink, wink. Like, come on. And why did the sergeant just kind of like hint at it instead of just saying, we're going to arrest you because you're impeding our investigation? Well, according to who is Holitz, I think her superior in the police station, I believed it was more effective to work with existing leadership to influence practices and attitudes regarding child abuse reporting rather than to pursue criminal enforcement at that stage. That said, criminal charges for failure to report remain a possibility in such cases. When Labor spoke to Bruckelmyer, she read him the entire mandated reporter law over the phone, line by line, then texted it to him. They are treating this pastor like a child because he doesn't seem to care or know what the law says. They're explaining it to him line by line. Like, listen, I don't know why they're treating him like a baby here. We are talking about the abuse of children, and they're treating the pastor with kid gloves. I mean, I don't know why they're treating this grown-ass man like a child who doesn't know how basic laws work. They gave him the benefit of the doubt. He never earned the benefit of the doubt. He refused to do everything in his power to protect children. He refused to do anything in his power that could have prevented this abuse. So all of this started in 2017 when cops were aware that this could be happening. But again, no one at this church was speaking up about it because they believed you forgive and forget. It wasn't until 2023 that anything changed. 2023. Why? Because one of Massie's own relatives told police about the abuse she suffered at his hands. So now we're not talking about someone connected to the church. We're talking about his own relative. And at that point, there was a new officer. His name is Adam Kleffman. He took over the case and he decided to contact that girl from 2017. At the time, her family didn't want to cooperate with the cops, but it's been several years. Maybe things have changed in the intervening years. After all, the girl at this point, she was now a married mother with a lot of trauma. Maybe she was willing to go forward with the case now. And that suspicion proved to be useful. Like, she did speak up. And with the help of those two people, the relative of Massie and that girl, Kleffman was able to start contacting other potential victims. But it didn't always go well. Check this out from the article. One woman told Kleffman that Massie had asked for forgiveness. The sin, she said in the recorded call, was washed away in the blood of reconciliation. It is gone forever, she told Kleffman. So you're following what the church says to do? Kleffman replied. I'm following what God says to do, the woman told him before hanging up. So this woman does not want to press charges because she believes it's forgotten now. There's another part I want to share with you here, which is very disturbing. At one point, the cops bring in Bruckelmyer and Massie. Oh, I'm sorry, they bring in Massie for questioning. Check this out. Massie told Kleffman and another officer that Bruckelmyer had spoken to him at least 3 times about inappropriate behavior with children. The investigators asked how many more girls might come forward with stories about him touching or kissing them. I mean, there could be hundreds. Hundreds. What the hell? And again, none of that matters unless they were willing to testify against him, because this church had brainwashed all those victims into saying, yeah, it happened. Just forgive him and move on with your life. I'm not even blaming the victims here. I mean, that's a sad situation to be in, but this is what they were taught. You don't speak out against this stuff. There is video in the ProPublica article because the cops brought in Bruckelmyer and another preacher at the church to talk about all this and to remind them that they are mandated reporters. And they told both of those preachers that if you tell a child to forgive and forget, that could be seen as witness tampering because they're basically telling the kids to remain silent. But the preachers were like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what my responsibility is, even though it was explained to them line by line years earlier. In that video, they keep saying things like, of course the victims can talk to you. We never said don't talk to the cops. But what did they tell those victims? They said, forgive this man and then forget about it. And that if they brought up the issue again, they would be going against God's wishes. So even if they weren't stopping the girls from going to the cops, they very much nudged them in the opposite direction. So by the time Massie faced any criminal charges, first of all, Bruckelmyer avoided any penalties for failing to report abuse because the statute of limitations had run out. And because it took so long for the charges to get filed, basically because of the negligence of the pastors at this church, a lot of those victims saw no justice whatsoever. Look at this. Court filings listed 9 alleged victims, but only 3 of the cases resulted in charges of felony sexual conduct with the victim under the age of 13. The statute of limitations under South Dakota had run out for 2 people who lived there, and the girl who had been pressured to forgive Massie in Bruckelmyer's office hadn't had her case charged either. Under Minnesota law, too much time had passed between her initial report and the prosecution. Nevertheless, 6 of the alleged victims whose cases did not result in charges were still part of the case. Some of them traveled to Duluth in last December to testify at his trial, but just after jury selection, Massie agreed to plead guilty to 4 felony counts. 1 charge was dropped. And do you know what that means? After jury, they were going to have a trial for Massie. If there was a trial, all of these victims who came to watch his trial could have taken the stand and spoken out against him. But as soon as jury selection was over and this was going to be a thing that was going to happen, Massie said, I'm just going to go ahead and plead guilty to 4 of these charges. I will take the 7 years he got in prison. I'll take that because you know what that meant? That meant there was no need for a trial anymore because he was already pleading guilty, which means none of those survivors had their chance to finally speak out against him. They also never got to explain how the church mishandled everything. And honestly, without this reporting, odds are we would not be hearing their stories at all because the pastor didn't want their stories to be told. And by the nature of the legal system, their stories were not going to be told in a public way. Now, some of the survivors have since filed lawsuits against Massie and the church and the overall old Apostolic Lutheran Church of America. But that doesn't prevent the church from downplaying the seriousness of what happened. Like there's no indication they're going to change their ways to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. So if you take any lesson from this story, it's that these situations are never just about one predator. It's about the entire religious system designed to protect them. And it shows how forgiveness can be treated as a weapon and used as a shield for the abusers, right? It's a cage for the abused. Like forgive him and then you go back in your cage and never speak about this again. The church always wanted forgiveness, forgetting that is something you have to earn. That's why it was never an actual pathway to healing. That's also why mandated reporting is so important, because institutions and pastors and self-anointed moral authorities, they cannot be trusted to police themselves. Especially if they tell you they run a Christian church, you should not assume they are on the moral high ground. Right? Clergy members who bury abuse under reconciliation, they are not offering spiritual care, they are obstructing justice. They would rather protect the institution than the children. And honestly, Bruckelmyer is complicit in everything that happened here because he knew about it. He wasn't uninformed. Like he was told repeatedly by police what his obligations were. And instead of doing the responsible thing, he chose silence and secrecy. And he sided with the predator. And that allowed all this abuse to continue. What did Massie say? There might be hundreds of girls. And that's why you got to hold these people accountable. You remember we talked about this sort of law in Washington state that would not only require pastors to be mandated reporters, but it would not give them any exception if they heard about the abuse in the act of confession. But in Minnesota, they have the confession exception. If you learn about it through confession, you could still keep it a secret. And even then, clergy members did not follow the law. At what point can we all agree mandated reporting doesn't work with clergy members because they always treat it as a suggestion and they're never seriously punished for violating it? Like mandated reporting cannot be optional just because it's inconvenient for you and your church. So without real accountability, this cycle will continue and the consequences are going to be devastating for the kids who are least able to fight back. So I encourage you to read the ProPublica and Minnesota Star Tribune article. It's a tough thing to read, but it is important. And then you should share that with the religious people you know. All right. Going to stop there. What questions we got here? Yeah, that's the right reaction to all of this. Pastors should be locked up too for enabling. I mean, I don't know what the law says about that, but it's hard to imagine anything differently, right? Like, why isn't that happening? Why doesn't he face any kind of punishment for what he has done? Thanks for that donation. Just made a video on my shorts about mandated reporting being a problem. Dean Euler's story is incredible. Cool. Go check out that short if we could find it up there. And Den will share the link if we need that. To be fair, I don't think our justice system addresses these cases ideally, but not addressing them is just wrong. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Like, I know plenty of people have problems with the cops and the way we police in this country anyway, legit criticisms. But in this case, the police seem to have their hands tied behind their backs because they couldn't do much under the law. They couldn't do much if victims were not willing to speak out about it. They can't press charges. And the people who are in a position to do so, like the pastor, decided, no, I'm just going to stay shut. I care about the abuser more than the abused. You can forgive a person with the compulsive behavior, but they're going to keep doing it. I mean, that's the thing. Like I said, forgiveness has to be earned. And the people here were not interested in anyone earning forgiveness because Massie just kept doing what he did. Forgiveness is an action. Yeah, well said. And they didn't do any action. I wonder why women are leaving their churches, but men are more religious than ever. Isn't that a scary thing? Especially like young conservative men are flocking to churches because I know like there they get treated like kings. They run their families. And that's a scary change that is happening. If you ever listen to Theo Bros online, they very much are like, mask off. We want patriarchy. Women shouldn't have the right to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to hold public office. And this is the way God wants it. It's a scary place to be on the internet. This kind of dovetails with the Riley Gaines story this week. Yeah, I don't know if you saw that. I forgot where that was published. Was that The Nation? But basically, someone did a whole story on the anti-trans bigot, Riley Gaines, who famously placed 5th in a college swim meet, tying with Leah Thomas, who is a trans swimmer. And she used that as a starting point to basically become a spokesperson for anti-trans bigotry. But the big thing that you learn in that piece that I did not know before I read it is that why is Riley Gaines going anti-trans? Yes, she wants to protect women's sports and stuff, but really it's about, they spend so much time talking about how trans swimmers, they have to change in the same locker rooms that us. And it's predatory. And isn't that awful? And we have to stop that. Meanwhile, Riley Gaines' coach at college, where she was that swimmer, was he charged with being a sexual predator? I don't remember her speaking about him against him at all. And in her book that came out recently, she praises him nonstop. So if she actually cares about predatory behavior and abuse, there was an obvious person she could have gone against who was the cisgender straight dude who was her coach. But instead, she's going after the fictional boogeyman of a trans swimmer who she competed against. Yep, they're all aiming in the wrong direction because they just want to, they don't actually care about any of this stuff.